The wagon was already hitched when he found her. Beau stood in the gray light of early morning, his boots still unlaced, his shirt half-buttoned against the chill that rolled off the Wyoming hills, and he stared at the woman loading her trunk onto the flatbed with the kind of deliberate, mechanical efficiency that told him she had been awake all night planning this. Every movement she made was contained, controlled, like she was holding something enormous inside her chest and refusing to let it crack her open in front of him. "Rosalind," he said. She did not stop. "Rosalind, look at me." She lifted the second crate, a heavy thing filled with her iron pots and her dried herbs and the little glass jars she kept lined up on the kitchen shelf, and she set it on the wagon bed with a careful thud. Her dark hair was already pinned back tight. She was wearing her traveling dress, the plain brown one she had arrived in 4 months ago, and the sight of it hit him somewhere below the ribs. "You cannot do this," he said, and he heard the desperation in his own voice and did not care. He had spent too many years being proud and contained and reasonable. He did not have that kind of time anymore. She turned then. Her eyes were red-rimmed but dry, and the expression on her face was worse than tears would have been. It was the look of a woman who had made a decision so painful that she had already cried herself past the point of it. She had gone somewhere further and colder, somewhere he could not easily reach. "There is nothing to discuss, Mr. Farrell," she said, and the formality of it, the return to that careful distance she had kept in those early weeks, hit him like a fist to the throat. "There is everything to discuss. You cannot ride away from this ranch and act like the last 4 months meant nothing." "I am not acting like anything." Her voice was steady and quiet and absolutely devastating. "I came here to cook for the season. The season is over." "No," he said. "No, it is not, and you know that it is not." For just a moment her composure wavered. Something moved behind her eyes, fast as a bird startled from a branch, and then it was gone. She turned back to the wagon and he crossed the yard in 4 long strides and put his hand over hers where it rested on the wagon's sideboard. He felt her go still beneath his touch. "Please," he said, which was not a word that came easily to him. "Please do not go." She looked down at his hand on hers, and the silence between them was full of every secret and every fear and every moment they had circled around each other for months without saying the true thing. And then, in that silence, she finally said it. "You told me about the offer, Beau. I heard you talking to Patterson. I know what you agreed to." The word betrayal landed between them like a stone thrown into still water, and the ripples went out in every direction, touching everything. 4 months earlier, the summer had arrived in Fremont County the way it always did, with a kind of brutal optimism. The sky went enormous and blue, and the grass came up thick and green on the lower pastures, and Beau stood on the porch of the ranch house his father had built in 1871, and felt the familiar mix of pride and anxiety that came with running 1,200 head of cattle on 30,000 acres of Wyoming territory. It was 1884, and the cattle business was changing. The big Eastern investors had discovered that beef made fortunes, and they were pushing into Wyoming with their capital and their lawyers and their cold-eyed land agents. And a man who had worked the same ground for 15 years and loved it the way you loved something that had also half killed you was starting to feel the pressure from every direction. He needed a cook for the season. That was the plain and simple reality of it. His last cook, a grizzled man named Hendricks who had fed 40 cowboys beans and salt pork for 7 years and complained about both the work and the wages, had departed in April with 2 months back pay and a cough that had finally gotten too serious to ignore. The bunkhouse was full of men who could ride and rope and brand, but not one of them could produce a meal that did not result in general misery. And a hungry crew was a slow crew. And a slow crew in the middle of a branding season was money walking out the gate. His foreman, a lean and weathered man named Chester Polk, who had been with the Farrell Ranch since Beau was 22 years old, had brought him the news on a Tuesday morning while they were checking fence line along the north pasture. "There is a woman in Lander," Chester said, in the casual way he had of delivering information that he knew would cause complications. "Widow, name of Rosalind James. She cooked for the Morrison outfit 2 seasons back, and by all accounts, the men would have followed her back to Ohio if she had let them. Morrison says she kept a kitchen cleaner than a church and made a beef stew that would make you weep." "A woman," Beau said. "That is generally what the word widow implies, yes." Beau rode fence line in silence for a moment, thinking about it. There was nothing unusual about a woman cooking for a cattle outfit. It happened. But there was something in Chester's careful, casual delivery that suggested he had more to say. "What else?" Beau said. Chester adjusted his hat. "She is particular. Morrison says she will not be spoken to rudely and will not work in a kitchen that is not properly supplied, and she has a list of conditions." A list, written out on paper. Beau almost smiled. It had been a long time since anything had almost made him smile. "Send word that I will meet with her," he said. He rode into Lander on Thursday in his good coat, which was not a thing he did often. The town had grown considerably in the past 5 years, with a proper main street now featuring a hotel and a dry goods store and a telegraph office and 2 competing saloons. And the railroad's influence was beginning to pull people in from directions that Lander had never previously connected with. He tied his horse at the post in front of the hotel and found his way to the small boarding house on the south end of Main Street where Rosalind James was staying. She met him in the parlor. He had prepared himself for several versions of what a widowed cook might look like, but he had not prepared himself for her. She was perhaps 28 years old, though there was something in her bearing that made her seem older, a kind of settled gravity that women generally took longer to acquire. She was not small or soft-spoken or particularly anxious to please. She was medium height with dark hair and gray eyes and a direct gaze that she did not drop when he introduced himself, and she shook his hand the way a person shook hands when they meant to be taken seriously. "Mr. Farrell," she said, "thank you for coming." "Miss James," he said, and then corrected himself, "Mrs. James. Chester Polk says you are looking for seasonal work." "I am considering it," she said carefully. "I have several inquiries." He respected that she said it plainly and without apology. "May I see the list?" he said. She handed it to him across the small table between them. He read it without letting his expression change, which took some doing because the list was thorough. She required a kitchen that was properly maintained, meaning a good stove in working order, adequate counter space, proper storage for dry goods and perishables. She required that supplies be ordered to her specification and delivered on time. She required that she be addressed respectfully, and that any disagreements with her work be brought to her directly and privately rather than voiced in front of the crew. She required Sundays off unless there was an emergency, and she defined what constituted an emergency. She required that she be housed separately from the bunkhouse in accommodations that were clean and secure. "The pay," he said. She named a figure that was higher than he had expected. He folded the list and placed it on the table between them and looked at her. "Morrison spoke well of your work," he said. "I spoke well of his outfit when I left it," she said evenly. "I am not difficult to work for. I am simply clear about what I require. An employer who knows what I need can give me what I need and we will get on fine. An employer who thinks my requirements are negotiable will find that they are not. He studied her for a moment. There was nothing aggressive in her tone, only a settled certainty that he found, to his surprise, not irritating but deeply interesting. He had known a great many people who communicated needs through complaint and manipulation. He had rarely known one who simply stated them. "Agreed," he said. He extended his hand. "All of it." She shook it. Her hand was warm and her grip was firm, and it lasted exactly the right amount of time. "When do I start?" she said. "Monday," he said. She arrived on Monday on the mail stage, which stopped at the ranch road twice a week, with a trunk and 2 crates and a carpet bag, and a small clay pot containing a herb plant of some kind that she carried in her arms the way other people carried infants. He sent 2 of his younger hands, brothers named Will and Donnie Sutter, to help with the luggage, and he watched from the porch as she directed them with quiet authority. And they obeyed without the slyness or mockery that younger men sometimes showed toward women in positions of authority. The kitchen was in the back of the main house, a large room that had been built to feed a big crew, but had suffered from years of Hendrix's indifference. She walked through it once without speaking, opened every cabinet, tested the stove, ran her finger along the shelf above the dry sink, and then turned to Beau, who had followed her in without thinking about whether he should. "The stove needs new blacking," she said. "The flour barrel is infested. The coffee grinder needs to be replaced. The mechanism is stripped. The shelving here needs to be secured to the wall or someone is going to be badly hurt. I will need the following items from Lander by Thursday." She produced a pencil from her pocket and wrote on a scrap of paper she took from the same pocket, and he realized she had been prepared for exactly this kind of kitchen. She handed him the list without looking up. "I will have Chester ride in tomorrow," he said. "Friday at the latest," she said. The first week she fed the crew twice a day, noon and evening, and by Wednesday there was a different quality to the way his men came in from the range. Something had changed in the atmosphere of the meal, in the way they took off their hats and sat down and waited. On Thursday, one of the older hands, a quiet man named Ezra Banks, who had been with the outfit for 6 years and had never in that time said anything complimentary about a meal, stopped at the kitchen door and said, "Madam, that was the finest chicken I have eaten in 20 years. Rosalind looked up from where she was scrubbing the cookpot and said, "Thank you, Mr. Banks. Tell your friends to stop tracking mud past the threshold and I will make it again on Sunday." The mud stopped by Friday. Beau ate his own meals in the main house, which was the standard arrangement. He had built the dining room table himself from rough-cut timber the year after his father died, and he sat at it every evening with Chester, and sometimes 1 or 2 of the senior hands, and they talked through the day's work the way working men did, practically and without ceremony. But he was aware, in a way he had not expected to be, of the kitchen at the end of the hall, of the sounds it made in the evenings, the soft knock of pots and the hiss of steam, and occasionally, very low and private, a woman's voice humming something he could not quite make out. He did not think of himself as a lonely man. He thought of himself as a busy man. There was a considerable difference, or at least there had always seemed to be. The third week she was there, he came into the kitchen late because he needed the lantern that was kept on the shelf above the stove, and he found her at the kitchen table with a book open in front of her, and a cup of something hot at her elbow and her hair down. She was wearing a plain nightgown with a heavy shawl pulled around her shoulders, and her feet were tucked up under her on the chair, and she looked completely different from the contained and capable woman who ran his kitchen with military efficiency. She looked young. She looked like a person who was alone and had arranged herself for it, had made a small private world out of a lamp and a book and a warm drink, and he felt with sudden sharp clarity that he was intruding on something that was not meant to be seen. She looked up. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "I need the lantern," he said. "It is right there," she said, and her voice was different too, softer and less arranged. He took the lantern and left and stood in the hallway for a moment before he went back to his study, and he thought, with some alarm, that he would like very much to have been invited to sit down at that table. He did not act on this. He was not a man who acted on things carelessly. He had built what he had by being methodical and patient and clear-eyed about what was real and what was wishful, and he applied these same qualities to the business of not thinking about Rosalind James. He was largely unsuccessful. The work of summer pressed in around them. The branding season ran through June with the particular chaos and noise that it always produced. 40 men working from before sunrise to after dark. The smell of wood smoke and burning hair and livestock. The constant movement of horses and cattle. She fed them through all of it, somehow keeping pace with the irregular hours and the enormous appetites, and the particular grievances that men doing hard work in hot weather could generate. He watched her manage it, and he understood that what she was doing was not simple. She was running a logistics operation in a stone kitchen with a wood stove, and whatever supplies Chester could haul in twice a week. And she was doing it with the competence of someone who had been doing hard things competently for a long time. He learned in pieces, and without asking directly, that her husband had died 3 years before. His name had been Thomas James, and he had been a farmer outside of Rawlins, and the farm had not survived his death, not because of bad management, but because of a bad winter and a banknote that came due at the wrong time. She had paid what she could, and left what she could not, and come away with her cooking skills and her practical intelligence and her list of conditions. And she had been making her way since then without complaint and without apparent self-pity. He respected this in a way that was almost physical. He knew what it was to have something you had worked for taken from you. His father had built the Farrell Ranch from nothing and had worked it until a horse threw him in the spring of 1875, and he had not recovered from the injury. And Beau had been 25 years old and entirely unprepared and entirely determined at the same time. He had been in debt for 6 years. He had nearly lost the North Pasture twice. He had gotten through it and built something solid, but he had not gotten through it without scars, and he recognized in Rosalind the particular posture of a person who had survived something and rebuilt around the shape of it. It was in late June that the first real conversation happened. Not the practical kind, the kind about the stove or the supply list or what was needed for the week, but the other kind, the kind that goes somewhere you did not plan to go when you started. He had come in from a long day checking on the cattle that had been moved to the summer pasture in the hills, and he had found her on the back porch in the last of the evening light, sitting on the step with a tin mug of coffee, watching the hills go purple and orange. He had almost gone back inside. Instead, he sat down on the step beside her, leaving a proper distance between them, and looked at the same view she was looking at. "I forget sometimes," she said after a long, quiet moment, "that it is beautiful here." "Do you like Wyoming?" he asked. "I am not sure that like is the right word," she said thoughtfully. "It is too large for that. It is the kind of place that asks something of you and you find out whether you can give it." He thought about this. "Did you find out?" he said. She looked at him, and he saw in her expression the kind of assessment she was always doing, quiet and thorough and not unkind. "Still finding out," she said. They sat there until the light was fully gone, talking about small things at first and then gradually less small things. And when she finally stood and went inside, he sat for a while longer in the dark with his coffee gone cold, and thought that he was in considerable trouble. July arrived, and with it the particular intensity of the full summer season. The cattle market in Cheyenne was good, and there was talk that it would stay good through fall, which meant that pushing the herd to weight and condition was worth every hour of labor. Beau was up before dawn every morning and often not in until well past dark, and he was aware, in the way that exhausted people become aware of certain things, of how the kitchen represented something different now than it had before. She had learned things about him without his noticing. She knew he drank his coffee black, and that he preferred his eggs fried rather than scrambled, and that he had a weakness for gingerbread that he had apparently not successfully concealed. It was in mid-July that he met with the man named Patterson for the first time, and the meeting was the beginning of the thread that would eventually unravel everything. Thaddeus Patterson was a land agent out of Cheyenne, a well-dressed, well-spoken man in his mid-40s who represented a consortium of Eastern investors who were buying up grazing land across Wyoming on the theory that the cattle boom would continue indefinitely. He arrived at the ranch on a Wednesday morning in a hired buggy with a briefcase and a self-possession that he wore like a coat, and Beau received him in the study with Chester present. The offer was considerable. Patterson wanted to lease the north pasture, 3,500 acres of the best grass on the property, for a period of 3 years, with an option to purchase at a predetermined price at the end of that term. The lease payment was more money than Beau had ever been offered at one time, and in the current climate, with the cattle market unpredictable and the pressure from Eastern capital only increasing, it was not an unreasonable thing to consider. He told Patterson he would think about it. Patterson left his card and said he would return in a week. After Patterson left, Chester said, "That is a lot of money." "Yes," Beau said, "a lot of things you could do with that money." "I know what I could do with it," Beau said, which closed the conversation. He thought about it for days. The north pasture was the pasture his father had broken himself acquiring, the one that cost the most in the debt years, and the one that he loved the most of all the land he had. But it was also the pasture that would keep the operation afloat if the market turned, the kind of financial cushion that could mean the difference between holding on and losing everything. He was not a sentimental man, or he had worked very hard at not being one. What he had not anticipated was that Rosalind would hear part of the conversation when Patterson returned the following Wednesday. He had not thought to consider where she might be in the house when Patterson came back. She was always in the kitchen at that hour. It was her bread-baking hour, the time she guarded with particular ferocity against interruption. But the study window was open because of the heat, and the house was built in a way that carried sound, and what she heard, or what she thought she heard, was enough to change everything. She heard Patterson say that the option to purchase was not just for the north pasture. She heard him say that the deal could be restructured to include the home section of the ranch, the central 3,000 acres that contained the house and the outbuildings and the water rights, if Farrell was willing. She heard Beau say that he would consider it. What she could not hear from where she stood was the rest of the sentence. She could not hear that Beau had said he would consider it only if Chester were given right of first refusal on the main house and the outbuildings, because Chester had no family and the Farrell Ranch was the only home he had known for 12 years. She could not hear that what Beau was actually discussing was how to protect the people who depended on the place, not how to sell it out from under them. She could not hear the part where he said that he had no intention of accepting the offer, and was only keeping the conversation going because Patterson had connections that could be useful when it came to negotiating the cattle contracts in the fall. What she heard was a man she had started to trust, making what sounded like a secret arrangement to sell the ground from under an entire operation, including the bunkhouse and the kitchen and the life she had spent 4 months building inside it. She said nothing that evening. She served dinner, and she was, as she always was, capable and composed. And if she was a little quieter than usual, he attributed it to the heat and the long day and did not push it. He had learned by then that she moved through her interior life with privacy, and that she would say what she needed to say when she was ready to say it, and that questions before she was ready produced nothing useful. What he did not know was that she had already made her decision by the time she served dessert, and that she had spent the evening counting the weeks until the end of the season. August was the cruelest month because he did not know what was wrong and she would not tell him. And in the space between them, something that had been building all summer continued to build even as she began, slowly and invisibly, to withdraw. It had been, up to that point, a summer of accumulated moments. He could have listed them, every one, in the precise order they had happened, because he had been aware of each one as it occurred with the heightened attention of someone who knows that something is happening, but does not yet know what to call it. The morning in June when she had come out to the corral to tell him that the stove needed a new firebox brick, and had stayed to watch him work a green horse for 20 minutes without saying anything, just watching with her arms resting on the top rail and her eyes following the horse, and he had been conscious of that watching in a way he could not explain. The afternoon in early July when a thunderstorm had come up fast and violent, and he had found her standing in the kitchen doorway watching the lightning hit the hills, not afraid of it but not pretending not to feel it either, and he had stood beside her in the doorway and they had watched it together, the two of them close enough that he could have touched her without stretching, and neither of them had moved away. The Sunday in mid-July, her day off, when he had come across her sitting in the long grass near the creek reading her book, and instead of riding past as he should have, he had dismounted and tied his horse and sat down a few feet from her and said, without planning to, "What are you reading?" She had held up the book so he could see the spine. It was a collection of essays by Ralph Waldo Emerson, which was not what he had expected, and his expression must have shown it because she said, "What were you expecting?" "I do not know," he said honestly. "You expected something more domestic," she said, but without accusation, with only a mild observational quality. "I did not expect Emerson," he admitted. "My mother kept a copy," she said. "She was the most practical woman I have ever known. She could put up 40 jars of tomatoes in a day and quote philosophy while she did it. She said that a person who did not think about things would eventually stop seeing them." She paused. "My mother saw everything." He had looked at her in the long July grass with her book on her lap and her face open and unguarded in the way it was when she was not in the middle of managing something. And he had thought, with a clarity that was almost uncomfortable, that he had not talked to anyone this way in a very long time. Not since his father died, maybe. Not a conversation that moved between practical things and real things without a seam. He had not told her this. He had talked about Emerson instead, which he had read himself in his 20s, sitting up late by the fire in the years when he was learning how to be alone in the place his father had left him. And they had talked for an hour, and then she had picked up her book, and he had mounted his horse, and they had gone their separate ways, and he had spent the rest of the afternoon doing work with a distractedness that Chester noticed and did not remark on. And there were smaller moments. A joke she had made at dinner that was so dry and unexpected that it had made him actually laugh, and the way she had looked surprised by his laugh, as though she had not expected it to be that easy. He had been learning her language of caring, the particular way she expressed things she felt but rarely said directly. He had not told her he was learning it, but he had been, And then August came and something changed and he could not identify what it was. She was not unkind. She was not cold. She was still exact and capable and occasionally funny. And she still sent food out with Chester on the days when the work ran long. And she still stood in the kitchen doorway some evenings and said ordinary things about the weather or the next week's supplies. But she had stepped back behind something. There was a new formality, subtle and careful, like a woman who had been standing close to a fire and had decided to take one measured step backward. He asked Chester if he had noticed anything. Chester looked at him for a long moment and said, "I notice plenty of things." "That is not an answer," Beau said. "No," Chester agreed and went back to mending harness. He went to her directly. He waited until after dinner one evening when the bunkhouse had quieted and the ranch was settling into its nighttime sounds, and he knocked on the kitchen door, even though it was his own kitchen in his own house, because it had become, through the summer, her domain, and knocking felt right. "Come in," she said. She was washing the last of the dishes, her back to him. He sat down at the kitchen table, which was the first time he had sat at it since the night he came for the lantern and found her reading, and he put his hands flat on the worn wood of it and said, "Something is wrong. I would like to know what it is." She finished the dish she was washing and dried her hands on her apron and turned around and leaned against the dry sink and looked at him. There was something in her expression that was careful and something that was sad. And under both of those things, there was something that looked like it was working very hard not to be more than it was. "Nothing is wrong," she said. "I have been watching you manage things your whole life," he said, which surprised both of them because it contained an intimacy that went past what he had intended to say. He watched her register it. He watched her decide whether to push it away. "You have known me for months," she said quietly. "Long enough," he said, and he meant it, and she could see that he meant it, and for a moment the careful thing in her expression trembled. "I am fine," she said. "I am simply aware that the season will end. It is better, I think, not to lose track of that." He sat with this for a moment. "And if I did not want the season to end," he said, she looked at him. The air between them was something he could feel on his skin. "That is not a practical question," she said. "No," he agreed. "It is not." They were quiet for a long time. The night outside was full of cricket sound and distant cattle sound, and the wind that came down off the hills after dark. She stood with her hands clasped in front of her, and he sat with his hands flat on the table and neither of them moved. "Good night, Mr. Farrell," she said at last, with that careful formality that he now understood was not coldness but armor. "Good night, Mrs. James," he said, and got up and went back to his study and sat there for an hour doing nothing. September came in on a cool wind, and the grass began to change color, and Beau drove the cattle down from the summer pasture with his crew in the long golden days of early fall. And the work was hard and satisfying and exhausting the way he liked work to be, the kind of tiredness that had meaning to it. The herd was in good condition. The season had been good despite the anxiety of the spring. There would be cattle to sell in Cheyenne in October, and the price was favorable, and the ranch would carry through the winter with more security than he had had in several years. And all of it felt insufficient. Somehow, he found himself postponing things he had always done at this time of year. The Cheyenne trip, which he usually made in late September to arrange the fall contracts, the visit to the bank in Lander to review the accounts, the small winterizing tasks that needed doing before the cold set in. He postponed them, and then he found other work to do on the ranch, and he did not examine too closely why. He told Chester that he wanted to extend the season. Chester said that if the cook was agreeable to staying through October, the men would have no objection. He said it without looking up from the tally books he was keeping, which was Chester's way of saying he had noticed exactly what was happening and had decided to be helpful about it without making anyone uncomfortable. He went to Rosalind. It was a Saturday afternoon, the kind of warm, golden afternoon that September occasionally produced as a kind of valediction for the summer. And she was in the kitchen garden she had planted in May and tended all season, harvesting the last of the herbs before the frost took them. She was kneeling in the dirt with a basket beside her, cutting the sage and the rosemary and the thyme with small, clean strokes, and she had her sleeves rolled up, and her hair was coming loose, and there was dirt on her cheek. He leaned on the garden fence and watched her for a moment before she heard him. She looked up and pushed her hair back with her wrist and left a dirt smear in her hairline and did not seem to notice. "I would like to ask you to stay through October," he said. She sat back on her heels and looked at him. He could see her doing the calculation, the same careful consideration she applied to everything, and he watched her decide. "Through October," she said. "And perhaps," he said very carefully, "we might discuss November." She was quiet for a long moment. A butterfly moved through the garden behind her, orange and slow in the warm air. "Why?" she said, and the question was not defensive, only honest. She was looking at him with those direct gray eyes and asking him the real question. "Because I think you know why," he said. She looked down at the herbs in her basket. Her hands were still. "Beau," she said. And it was the first time she had used his given name since the early weeks when they were first learning how to talk to each other, before she had formalized back into Mr. Farrell, and the sound of it in her voice undid something in his chest. "I am not asking you for something you cannot give," he said. "I am only asking you to stay, for now, that is all." She looked up at him again, and there was something so unguarded in her face at that moment, something so open and afraid and wanting, that he had to look away for a second to give her privacy with it. "Through October," she said at last. "Through October," he agreed, and smiled at her, and she looked down at her herbs again, but he could see the corner of her mouth. October arrived, and the ranch settled into the particular beauty of Wyoming fall, the aspens going yellow on the hillsides, the mornings sharp and clear, the evenings coming early with a cold that had intent to it now. The cattle drive to Cheyenne happened in the second week, with Beau leading the outfit and Chester managing the logistics, and 20 men moving 800 head down through the long valley. It took 6 days, and Rosalind was there when he came back, which was a thing he had thought about for the entirety of those 6 days more than was probably reasonable. She had made a pot of chili and cornbread for the returning crew, and the bunkhouse was warm and well lit, and the men came in tired and dusty and grateful. And Beau came in last after seeing to his horse, and found her in the kitchen with her apron still on at 9 in the evening, cleaning up after feeding 40 people. "You should have let it wait until morning," he said. "I never leave a dirty kitchen overnight," she said, which he already knew. He picked up a dish towel and began drying the pots she had washed, which was not a thing he had done before and which caused a small silence. She handed him the next pot without comment. They worked side by side until the kitchen was clean, and then she poured 2 cups of coffee, and they sat down at the kitchen table together, which was new, and he told her about the drive and the market price and the negotiations in Cheyenne, and she listened and asked good questions. And somewhere in the middle of it, he realized that this was the conversation he had wanted to have for 6 days in the cold on the cattle trail. Not about the cattle, about all of it, with her. "The season is nearly over," she said when he had finished. It was not an accusation, it was something else. "I know," he said. "I heard you with Patterson," she said, and it came out flat and careful the way she said things she had been practicing saying. "The second meeting. I was at the kitchen window when he came in. I heard the discussion about the home section. He was very still. What did you hear? He said quietly. She told him. He listened to what she had misunderstood, and he could see as she laid it out exactly what it had looked like from the outside, exactly why she had heard what she had heard and understood it the way she had. And he could feel in the telling of it the month of quiet withdrawal, the careful step backward, the return to Mrs. James and formality and distance. He could feel what it had cost her. "You thought I was going to sell the ranch," he said. "I thought you had a hidden arrangement," she said. "I thought I did not know what I was looking at when I looked at you." "Rosalind," he said, and he put his hand over hers on the table the same way he had done in the yard that morning before she left, and he felt her go still in the same way. "The North Pasture lease is for the cattle market. It buys security. I have no intention of selling this ranch. I have spent 15 years making this ranch. And the conversation about the home section was me asking Patterson what the protections would be for Chester if I were ever to die or be unable to work. It was a question about care, not about selling." She looked at him. He could see it working through her, the reconfiguration of what she had built out of that misheard conversation, the way the architecture of the last month was shifting. "I did not ask you," she said at last. "I should have asked you." "You were afraid," he said, "of what the asking might mean." She did not deny it. She looked down at their hands on the table, his over hers, and she turned her hand slowly so that it was palm up and her fingers closed around his. "I am going to say this plainly," he said, "because I have been saying things around the edges of it for months, and I am done with that. I do not want you to leave this ranch. Not at the end of October, and not in November, and not in the spring. I want you to stay. I want you to stay because this place has been changed by you being in it, and I have been changed, and I would rather ask you plainly and be refused than let you ride away without having said it." She looked at him for a long time without speaking. Outside the window, the Wyoming night was enormous and cold and full of stars, and the fire in the stove made a soft, constant sound, and the kitchen smelled of coffee and clean wood, and the herbs she had dried and hung from the rafters in small tied bunches, sage and rosemary and thyme. "I am afraid of it," she said, "of building something and having it taken. I'm afraid of that more than I can say." "I know," he said. "I am afraid of it too." "You are?" The surprise in her voice broke his heart a little. "I had this ranch and I nearly lost it twice," he said. "I know what it is to pour everything into something and have the ground shift under you. I know that feeling exactly. And I have been afraid of it in this, all summer, afraid of what it would mean to care about something that could go wrong." She looked at him with an expression that was so full of recognition, so full of the particular relief of being seen accurately by someone who is not trying to comfort you with a simpler version of the truth, that he had to breathe through it. "What would it look like?" she said quietly. "If I stayed, it would look like whatever you wanted it to look like," he said. "You would tell me what you needed, you would keep your conditions, you would be met exactly where you are." The corner of her mouth moved. "I have a list," she said. "I know," he said. "I have read it very carefully." She laughed then, a real laugh, the kind that came up from somewhere unguarded, and the kitchen filled up with the sound of it, and he thought he had never heard anything as good as that. He asked her to marry him on a Sunday in late October, which was her day off, and which he chose carefully because it was the day that belonged to her and not to the work, because he wanted her to understand that what he was asking was about who she was outside the season, about the person who read Emerson in the kitchen by lamplight and watched lightning from doorways, and kept a clay pot with an herb plant in it like a portable piece of home. He did not make a grand ceremony of it. He found her in her favorite spot by the creek with her book, and he sat down in the grass beside her and he said, "I would like to marry you, Rosalind, if you are willing, if that is something you could want." She closed her book around her finger to mark the page. She looked at the creek, then she looked at him. "I need to tell you something first," she said. He waited. "My marriage to Thomas was a good one," she said carefully. "It was not a grand love story. We were suited, and we were kind to each other, and I am glad of the years I had. But I lost him, and I lost the farm, and I lost the life I thought I was building. And after that, I decided that the most honest thing I could do was be very clear about what I was and what I needed, and not arrange myself to be easier to love. And I was afraid that if I let myself feel what I have been feeling this summer, that was the end of the honest version of myself." He listened to all of this. "And now," he said, "and now I think I was wrong about the two things being in opposition," she said slowly. "I think being honest about what I am and loving you might be the same thing. I think that is actually what is happening." He looked at her. "You love me," he said, not as a question. Her face went pink in the October air. "Yes," she said, as though she was just confirming a practical fact. "I believe I do." "Good," he said, which made her laugh again. And then he took the ring from his pocket that he had ridden to Lander to acquire from the jeweler on Thursday while she thought he was checking cattle. A plain gold band with a small garnet set into it, because garnet was the deep red of the Wyoming autumn, and he had thought she would appreciate the connection. He held it out to her, and she looked at it for a moment, and then she took it and held it in her palm and looked up at him. "Yes," she said, which was the same answer she had given before and did not need to be said again, but which sounded like everything when she said it. They were married in November in the Lander church, a small ceremony with Chester as witness, and a woman named Agnes Porter, the wife of the dry goods store owner who had befriended Rosalind over the summer, standing beside her. It was a cold day with a thin crust of snow on the ground, and their breath showed white in the air when they came out of the church. And Beau put his coat around her shoulders, and she leaned into him, and the hills above Lander were the color of iron, and the sky was the color of steel, and the whole world felt clean and honest and his. The winter was long and quiet and theirs. The ranch contracted as it always did in the cold months, the crew reduced to the core hands who stayed on through the year, the pace slower and more interior. She was learning the ranch in its winter version, the way the wind came through differently, the way the livestock behaved in the cold, the way the days shortened to a few hours of gray light and then expanded again imperceptibly toward February. He was learning her in her winter version, the way she baked in quantities when the cold was worst, the way she read late into the evenings when the work was done, the way she slept with the quilt pulled to her chin regardless of the temperature. He learned that she had a temper she managed carefully, and that when it finally appeared it was over practical things, things that were not efficient or that were needlessly wasteful, and that the best thing to do when it appeared was to listen to it honestly, and then solve whatever the underlying problem was. He learned that she cried at things in books and was not embarrassed about this and did not want to be comforted, only given privacy for it. He learned that she had strong opinions about horses and mild ones about politics, and fierce ones about what constituted a properly made cup of coffee. She learned that he woke in the night sometimes and went to the window and stood there in the dark looking out over the ranch, not anxiously but with the habitual watchfulness of a man responsible for a great many things, and she learned to let him have this. She learned that he was slow to be angry and very still when he was, and that the stillness was harder to navigate than a louder kind of anger would have been. And she learned to say the direct thing in those moments and not wait for the stillness to pass on its own. She learned that he was generous in ways he did not publicize, and that there were 3 families in the county who had made it through bad winters with provisions from the Farrell ranch without it ever being spoken of. In February, she told him she was expecting a child. He was at the kitchen table when she said it, the table that had been the site of so much between them, and he looked at her across it for a long moment, and then he got up and came around to her and put his hands on either side of her face and looked at her as though he was confirming something he had already suspected, but was not yet willing to have be certain. "Are you well?" he said. "I am very well," she said. He kissed her forehead and held her carefully, the way you held something that contained something precious, and she put her arms around his waist and pressed her face against his chest and felt him exhale slowly, a long, careful breath that had the quality of relief and wonder mixed together. The spring came with its usual optimism, the grass coming up bright, and the birds returning, and the whole enterprise of the ranch restarting after its winter stillness. The new season's cook was arranged, a capable older man named Harold Briggs, who had worked mining camps and cattle outfits across Wyoming for 20 years, because Rosalind was not cooking for the crew any longer but was not idle either. She had taken over the household accounts, which were a considerable undertaking on a ranch of this size, and she managed them with the same methodical intelligence she brought to everything. She had also, without making a fuss about it, begun to transform the main house from a functional bachelor establishment into a home, not in a way that erased what it had been, but in a way that added warmth to it. Curtains and rugs and the small accumulated details of a person who intended to stay. The Patterson situation resolved itself simply. Beau declined the lease on the north pasture when the fall market showed it was not necessary, and Patterson moved his interests further east toward Casper, and that chapter closed without drama. The Eastern investors, as it turned out, were overextended, and the cattle market corrected sharply in 1886, and Beau's caution in that period proved to have been exactly right, as caution in his experience usually did. The baby came in September, which was the same month the whole thing had begun to shift the year before, and which Rosalind found satisfying in a way that was almost poetic. It was a boy, large and vigorous and emphatic, and they named him James Thomas Farrell, the James for her family and the Thomas for her first husband's memory, which was Beau's suggestion and which meant more to her than she was able to say about directly for several days. Beau was present for the birth, which was not standard but which he had flatly refused to leave, sitting outside the bedroom door for 6 hours while Agnes Porter and the local physician managed the delivery, and coming in immediately when Chester knocked on the door and told him it was done. He came in and looked at the child and looked at Rosalind, and the expression on his face was the least controlled she had ever seen him, stripped entirely of the careful composure that he carried through the world. "He is very loud," she said from the bed, because she knew he was too full to speak and she was giving him a moment. "Yes," Beau said. "He will be your kind of person," she said. "Deliberate most of the time and then extremely emphatic about certain things. He has your stubbornness," Beau said. "He has your hands," she said, which was true. The baby had the same broad, capable hands, recognizable even in their miniature version. Chester, informed of the name through the closed bedroom door by Beau, spent a noticeable amount of time doing nothing in the vicinity of the barn over the following hour, which was his version of being moved. The life they built from that point was the kind of life that accumulated in layers, season over season, year over year, each year adding something. The north pasture stayed and the ranch grew, and the cattle operation stabilized at the kind of size where it was substantial without being unmanageable. Beau hired a second foreman as the operation expanded, and Chester finally got the house he had been promised. a small, solid structure at the east end of the property that he accepted without ceremony and clearly loved. James was a loud and determined infant and a loud and determined toddler, and showed every indication of becoming a loud and determined boy. And by the time he was 2, he had opinions about the horses and the cattle that he expressed at length to anyone who would listen, and several people who would not. When James was 3, Rosalind told Beau she was expecting again. This time he was more practiced and less visibly undone, though she knew him well enough by then to read the particular quality of his stillness as the same wonder in a more contained form. He brought her tea and sat with her in the evenings, and did not make her discuss anything she was not ready to discuss, which was one of the things she loved about him most. The way he gave her the room to move at her own pace while making it entirely clear that he was right there. The second child was a girl, born in the spring with the same vehement announcement of her own arrival that her brother had made, and they named her Eliza Frances Farrell, the Frances for Rosalind's mother, the woman who could put up 40 jars of tomatoes and quote Emerson at the same time. From the beginning, Eliza had her father's watchful eyes and her mother's exact and purposeful hands, and she and James conducted a sibling relationship of enormous mutual admiration, combined with constant low-level dispute that kept the household in a state of productive noise. The kitchen continued to be Rosalind's kitchen, even though she was no longer the sole cook of the operation. Harold Briggs ran the crew kitchen and did it competently, but the main house kitchen was hers, and she ran it the way she ran everything, with a precision and a generosity that were not in opposition to each other. The herb garden expanded. The clay pot that she had carried from Lander was still on the kitchen windowsill, the same plant, grown now into a large and untidy bush of rosemary that overflowed its pot and perfumed the kitchen all year long. In the evenings, sometimes, after the children were in bed and the ranch had gone quiet and the fire in the sitting room was low, they sat together in the particular comfortable silence of people who had nothing to prove to each other. She read. He looked over accounts, or sat with his hands open on his knees looking at the fire with the habitual attentiveness of a man who was watching over something he valued. Sometimes she read him a passage from whatever book she was in. Sometimes he told her things about the ranch's history that he had not told anyone, small stories his father had told him, the details of years he had spent here before she arrived. One evening in the 3rd winter of their marriage, he said, without any preamble, "I used to sit at that table in the study after my father died and look at the accounts, and think that the numbers were not the hardest thing. The hardest thing was that there was no one to talk to at the end of the day." She looked up from her book. He was looking at the fire. "The ranch was here," he said, "and it was worth everything I was putting into it, but it was silent in a way I had stopped noticing. I had stopped noticing that it was silent." She set her book down. "And then a woman arrived with a trunk and 2 crates and a list of conditions," she said. "And a clay pot," he said, and looked at her, and the expression in his eyes was the whole story, the whole 4 months and everything after it. "The clay pot was important," she agreed seriously. "It told me," he said, "that you had a self. That you were not going to leave it behind to fit somewhere. That wherever you went, you brought what mattered to you and you kept it alive." She looked at him for a long moment. "That is exactly what I was doing," she said softly. "I did not know anyone could see it." "I saw it from the beginning," he said. She crossed the room and sat beside him on the settee, and he put his arm around her, and she leaned into his side the way she had on the church steps years ago. And outside, the Wyoming winter moved across the land in its large and indifferent way, and inside the fire made its small, consistent sound, and the house that had once been silent held them both in its walls and was satisfied. The years passed with the particular richness of years that are lived in. James grew into a boy who could ride before he could reliably raid, and who had his father's deliberateness and his mother's precision, and who was at 8 years old already showing Beau the patience and intelligence that made Beau think the ranch would be in good hands long after he was done with it. Eliza at 6 was a serious and observant child who carried a small notebook everywhere and wrote in it things she did not share, which Rosalind found deeply familiar and did not intrude upon. There were hard years, as there always were. The winter of 1886 into 1887 was catastrophic across Wyoming, the kind of cold that killed cattle in their thousands across the territory and broke outfits that had seemed unbreakable. The Farrell Ranch lost a significant portion of its herd, and the following spring was the most anxious financial period since the early debt years. Beau worked 18-hour days, and Rosalind managed the household accounts with a strictness that felt familiar from her years after Thomas's death. And they moved through it together, with the same directness and honesty that had always been the foundation of them. No softening of the bad news, no pretending the situation was other than it was. On the worst evening of that difficult spring, when the numbers were as bad as they were going to be before they started improving, he sat at the kitchen table with his head in his hands for a moment, and she brought him coffee and sat down across from him and waited. "We are going to be all right," he said, not to reassure her but to say the thing out loud. "We are," she agreed. "It will take 2 years." "We have had 2 hard years before," she said. "We know what to do." He looked up at her. Her face was calm and honest and certain, and the certainty was not wishful but earned. The certainty of a person who had already been through the harder version of this, and had rebuilt from it, and knew what rebuilding cost, and knew she could do it again. "What did I do?" he said quietly, "before you came?" "You were doing fine," she said. "You just were not living as well as you are now." He reached across the table and took her hand, and they sat in the kitchen in the late evening with the finances spread out between them and the Wyoming spring making its tentative sounds outside. And the difficulty of the situation was real, and they did not pretend otherwise, and they were still, underneath and above it, entirely all right. They came through it. The herd rebuilt over the following 2 seasons, and the ranch stabilized again. And by 1889, when Wyoming was admitted to the Union as a state, which was a thing Rosalind marked with a dinner that was, according to Chester, the finest he had eaten in 20 years of eating very well, the operation was on firmer ground than it had been before the hard winter. Beau had diversified, adding horses to the cattle, and the horse operation grew into something he had not entirely anticipated, a reputation for quality animals that drew buyers from across the territory and eventually from further east. James at 12 was learning the horse operation with the focused intensity that Beau had shown at the same age learning the cattle, and Eliza at 10 had filled 3 notebooks and started a 4th, and was reading everything she could find in the small but growing library that Rosalind had built from the bookshelf in the parlor, which had started with the Emerson collection, and expanded steadily over 10 years until it occupied most of one wall. Agnes Porter, who had been a friend since the first summer and who had stood beside Rosalind at the Lander Church, had become a regular visitor, and the friendship between the 2 women was the kind that had accumulated enough history to be simply good, reliable and warm and honest. When Agnes's husband expanded the dry goods store and they built a proper house outside of town, the 2 families saw each other regularly, and the children knew each other well. Chester, in his house at the east end of the property, had been approached twice by other outfits offering him the position of head foreman at wages that were higher than what Beau could pay him, and both times he had declined, which was not something Beau took for granted. He told Chester so directly one evening when they were doing the fall inventory, and Chester said, "A man goes where he is needed and where the work means something. Both of those things are true here." He then went back to counting saddle blankets and the subject was closed. In the 12th year of their marriage, Rosalind told Beau she thought they should expand the kitchen. He looked at the kitchen, which had been expanded twice already, and which he had thought was now as large as anyone could reasonably want. "How large?" he said carefully. She unrolled a piece of paper on the table. She had drawn a plan, precise and detailed, which he should have expected because she always came to conversations with preparation. The expansion would add a proper larder, a cold storage room connected to the north wall where the temperature stayed low, and a second work table for the days when Harold Briggs was cooking for the crew, and she was cooking for the household simultaneously. And the current space produced a specific friction that she had tolerated for 12 years and had decided to stop tolerating. He looked at the plan, he looked at her. "When did you draw this?" he said. "This winter," she said. "How long have you been thinking about it?" 8 years, she said. He laughed. "Why did you not say something 8 years ago?" "There were other priorities," she said. "Now there are not." He built it for her that spring, himself, and 2 of the hands, and she came out every afternoon to check the progress and make suggestions that were incorporated without discussion, because she was always right about these things and they all knew it. When it was finished, she walked through it and assessed it and nodded once, a small decisive nod, and then turned to him with an expression of such genuine satisfaction that he thought he would have built it twice the size if that expression was the reward for it. James was 15 that year, and beginning to show the height he would eventually have, which was his father's height with his mother's proportions. And Eliza at 13 had her dark hair and gray eyes, and the same directness of gaze that had made Beau take his good coat out of the wardrobe 20 years before and ride into Lander to meet a widow with a list of conditions. The 20th anniversary of her arrival at the ranch was in May, and he marked it because he marked everything that mattered even though he did not generally announce that he was doing so. He had Chester order the particular tea she preferred from the supplier in Cheyenne that he did not ordinarily use because it was more expensive than practical, and he had it waiting on the kitchen table on the morning of the 17th, which was the date she had arrived on the stage, with 2 cups and the good china that had been a wedding gift from Agnes Porter and which Rosalind kept for occasions. She came into the kitchen in the early morning and stopped when she saw the table. "You remember the date," she said. "I remember every date," he said from the doorway. He was holding his coffee and watching her in the morning light that came through the east window, the light that hit the kitchen the way it had always hit it, the same as it had 20 years ago when he had first come in late looking for a lantern and found her reading at this table with her hair down. She looked different than she had then, as he looked different. They were both in their 40s now, both shaped by 2 decades of Wyoming weather and hard work and good living, and she was not the young widow in the boarding house parlor who had shaken his hand with the firmness of someone determined to be taken seriously. She was fully herself in a way that took years to become, settled and certain and more interesting than she had even been, and the gray in her dark hair was the silver of it and not the defeat of it. "Sit down," she said. He sat down. She poured the tea and he poured his own coffee, and they sat at the kitchen table in the morning light, and outside the Wyoming spring was beginning its annual argument with the last of the winter. The aspens not yet leafed out on the hillsides, the grass not yet fully committed to green, The sky a pale cold blue above the familiar line of the hills. "Do you remember what you said to me," she asked, "when you asked me to stay?" "I said that the place had been changed by your being in it," he said, "and that I had been changed." "Yes," she said. She wrapped her hands around the cup. "I was so afraid," she said. "I did not say how afraid I was." "I said a little of it, but not all of it." "I know," he said. "I was afraid too. I was afraid to say it to you, and I was afraid of what you would say, and I was afraid of what it would mean if you stayed, and I was afraid of what it would mean if you left." He paused. "Mostly I was afraid of what it would mean if you left." She smiled, the real smile, the one that went up to her eyes. "And now?" He looked at her across the table where they had talked their way through everything. Through the beginning, and the misunderstanding, and the reconciliation, and the proposal, and the bad winter, and the good years, and all the ordinary evenings that made up a life. Through 20 years of this specific kitchen, and this specific morning light, and this woman who had come for a season and stayed for a life. "Now," he said, "the only thing I am afraid of is that I do not tell you enough how entirely and completely this is everything I wanted. That I forget to say it plainly." She looked at him for a moment and her eyes were bright. "Say it plainly then," she said. "You are the best thing that has happened to this ranch," he said. "And you are the best thing that has happened to me. And this life we have, every hard year and every good one, is the life I would choose if I could choose it all over again, from the very beginning." She reached across the table and put her hand over his, palm to palm, fingers closing, the same gesture that had happened on this table 20 years before. "I came here to cook for the season," she said softly. "I know," he said. "I did not plan any of this. Neither did I. But I would not change any of it," she said. "Not one piece of it. Not the list or the misunderstanding or the fear or any of it, because all of it brought us here." He turned his hand so that his fingers were through hers, and they sat in the kitchen in the morning light, and the ranch made its morning sounds around them. The horses moving in the corral, the cattle in the near pasture, the sound of James's voice from somewhere near the barn, already at work at 15 with his father's sense of urgency about the day's work, and his mother's conviction that the work was worth doing right. The season that had started with a woman arriving on a mail stage with a trunk and a list of conditions had not ended. It had simply become a life. It had become the kitchen, and the creek sound, and the herb garden, and the rosemary in the clay pot on the windowsill, and the expansion added in the 12th year, and the two children who carried both of them forward into years they would not see. It had become the kitchen table, and the evening silence, and the books on the parlor wall, and the nights when he went to the window in the dark, and she let him have it without comment. It had become Chester in his house at the East End, and Agnes's friendship, and the Wyoming hills going purple and orange in the evening light that still, after 20 years, was capable of taking her breath. It had become the most ordinary and the most extraordinary thing, which was this: two people who had both been afraid, who had both been alone inside lives they had built with their own hands and their own determination, who had found each other in a kitchen at the end of a long summer day, and had been brave enough, eventually, to say the true thing. Outside the window, the Wyoming spring was still making its careful argument for warmth. The hills were still the hills. The horses were moving in the corral the way horses moved, with the particular purposeful ease of creatures in their proper element. The coffee was good, and the tea was good, and the kitchen smelled of rosemary and wood smoke and morning. Beau looked at his wife in the kitchen they had built together, in the morning light that had shown him her face for 20 years, and thought that the season had begun the day she rode in, and had not ended and would not end, and that this was precisely as it should be.